flip the switch and listen in on Berlin when they start chatting, but maybe you can say a few words to our audience.
Happily. And first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks everybody for coming. And I was listening a little bit to Rob. You know, I love doing live events because it really always live up to Murphy's Law. I shouldn't even say that.
My name is Daniel Schiele.
But you never know just how. So that's part of the anticipation. So whatever you see here, do remember, we do a miraculous job in post-production. And obviously we have a topic that is going to really engage our European audiences in, you know, a slightly different way than here, but we really, really want the American audience to jump in there with questions because they've got a number of the panelists in Berlin. We have only one or 1.575 here, so you, the audience, will make up for that, okay? Do you follow my thought here? So this is good. We have a beautiful day for it here in New York. And
I think we should be able to hear them. I'm not sure why we can't see them.
Okay, but we definitely know they're not there. I'm slow, but not that slow. It's not Halloween yet.
They can hear you.
Okay, great. Great. All right.
The idea exchange that has profound experience with organizing deep and detailed discussions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce founder and publisher of Zocalo Public Square, Gregory Rodriguez. I don't like to read things to people, but it was given to me, and I say thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Thank you.
Sounds like their version.
I'd like to thank Daniel and Democracy International. We're grateful to all the people at NPR Berlin, particularly Karen Roth. I'd like to thank our generous host here at Alfred Herrhausen Society at the Deutsche Bank. Zocalo Public Square is a nonprofit organization. We blend live events and ideas journalism. We syndicate our journalism to 250 papers across the United States and the world. In a time of too many opinions, particularly in the United States, we'd like to think that people actually want to hear ideas. We convene free events. We do it. We were in Honolulu 3 weeks ago. We were in Washington last week. We're in Berlin today. We're in Fresno next Tuesday. Fresno is a small Central Valley of California. And our idea is that we are a roaming public square and that giving people a chance, everybody is welcome to a Zocalo. They're all free. And we believe that community must be built around simple things like alcohol. So that was a joke. So therefore we invite you not only to hear high-level people speaking about important subjects, but we invite you to join all of us with a glass of wine or a glass of Coke Zero outside afterwards to talk further with the evening's guests and with each other. We're pleased to have a studio audience tonight in New York City watching this program. It's being recorded by America Abroad, a documentary radio program broadcast by public radio stations throughout the United States. NPR Berlin will also be rebroadcasting the program. I encourage you to check us out at zocalopublicsquare.org. You can fan us on Facebook, as well as follow us on Twitter @ThePublicSquare. If you're tweeting tonight, we're using the hashtag EU Refugees. If you haven't already, please silence your cell phones. Like in all our events, again, we ask you to join us to have a cup of wine with each other after the proceedings. I'm very happy to be introducing tonight's moderators, Ms. Alessandra Galloni and Ms. Jackie Leiden. Alessandra Galloni is Global News Editor for Reuters News Agency. She is co-author of From the End of the Earth to Rome on Pope Francis and has received both an Overseas Press Club Award and a British Journalism of the Year Award. Jackie Leiden, of course, is a veteran radio reporter and host who spent many years as a foreign correspondent for NPR, covering Iran, the Gulf Wars, and Afghanistan. She's also an author and the founding producer of the Seams broadcast. Jackie in New York will start us off. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. From Public Radio International, I'm Jackie Leiden, and this is America Abroad. Thank you so much for being here. this international public square. We're partnering today with Zocalo Public Square, Democracy International, and NPR Berlin to try to answer this question. What can the world learn from Europe's refugee crisis? Let's just take a moment to welcome our live audiences. We have one here at WNYC's Green Space in New York and the other at Deutsche Bank in Berlin, Germany. So hello, Berlin, and hello, New York City. My co-host in Berlin is Alessandra Galloni. Alessandra is the global news editor for Reuters. She previously spent 13 years at the Wall Street Journal across Europe. Alessandra, why don't you introduce us to your panelists there in Berlin?
Sure, Jackie. Well, immediately to my left is, and first is Naomi Steinberg. She is the director of the Refugee Council USA, which is a coalition of non-governmental organizations that are dedicated to refugee protection and welcome. Then further to my left is Wenzel Michalski. He's the director of Human Rights Watch in Germany, and he has been on the ground in Germany, the refugees that have come in through Syria, the Middle East, Northern Africa. Then further continuing to my left, we have Astrid Siepert, who is a migration fellow of the Europe program of the German Marshall Fund of the US. And last but not least, we have Susan Fratzky, who is a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. She is a specialist in EU asylum policy and labor market integration. So you can see that we have quite an accomplished panel over here in Berlin, Jackie.
All right, thank you so very much. Well, we're going to be dividing the conversation today into two halves of this hour-and-a-half long program. So first, we'll lay out the immediate crisis in Europe, and then we'll look forward to trying to find answers, solutions, and suggestions and policies for the coming months and years. So we're going to jump right in, go back to Germany, and Alessandra, why don't you have your panelists begin? Perhaps we'll hear first from Wenzel Michalski, who could give our audience, you mentioned that he's been on the ground in Germany with refugees coming in from Syria and all over, and tell us what things are like, the situation's so fluid, what things are like right now.
Absolutely. Wenzel, I'm going to pass it straight to you. What have you and your people people who work with you, seen on the ground in Europe?
Well, let me just put it very simple. The situation is terrible for the people who reach Europe and who arrive in Germany. Having said this, they're in a much better place than from where they come from. So, for example, I was in Athens the other day and I saw people camping on cardboard in a park, and I was pretty shocked to see whole families there being proud that they have a little bit of cardboard to sit on, and that was all what they had, and they looked really exhausted from the dangerous trip, a journey from Turkey over the dangerous Mediterranean. And our translator, who himself was a refugee 4 years ago, said, yeah, but look, they sleep, and they sleep in peace, and they're not in danger to being killed by the Taliban or by ISIS. And so you have to also see this in perspective. On the other hand, we see terrible, heartbreaking stories. The other day, colleagues of mine met a 10-year-old boy who was on his own in the first Greek hotspot, which was just opened, where there was a terrible apocalyptic atmosphere, and this little boy, you can imagine, was absolutely traumatized being there all on his own without any friends or any family and any help.
Now, I'm going to jump on this word hotspot, which some of you, especially in the US, might not know about, because hotspot is one of the policies that the EU has introduced to deal with this crisis. If we could quickly go through what have been the most successful instant policies that the EU has introduced in order to cope with this influx. And perhaps I could pass that both to the three of you. I mean, Astrid first perhaps, and Susan. What have been the most successful policies that have been introduced over these past dramatic months?
Well, it depends how you define successful, I would have to say. I mean, what we can say is that for the first time, we see that this issue is taken seriously. And it has taken the EU a long, long time to react on this issue at all. We have seen an EU Commission that has now put the migration plan into place in the springtime. We have seen that they have come to agreement over a relocation plan. It took them a long time. It is for 160,000 people. One can ask, is this
Explain to our
immediate?
US audience the relocation plan, the hotspots, very briefly,
Yes.
so that we're all on the same page.
So we know that there are countries like Italy and Greece that receive most of the asylum seekers. And in order to make sure that the people can be processed in an orderly manner, so far we used to, or we still have the Dublin Agreement, where the people the country where they first arrive, this is also where they have to stay and get processed and go through the whole registration process, etc. For a long, long time, countries like Germany stayed back because they were surrounded by so-called safe third countries, meaning because it's impossible, either you parachute into Germany or you come through the North Baltic Seas. Otherwise, you're surrounded by safe third countries where like Italy or Greece, where the people have to first get processed. Now, we see that it was not sustainable anymore. Italy and Greece were not able to really process all of these people coming either through the Mediterranean or now also from Turkey to the Greek islands. And they have been saying this for a long, long time. It was not a surprise. It was everyone knew about this. Germany kind of leaned back and said, "Oof, it's it's not our problem in a way." But now they have finally realized it is also it has to be on their agenda, and we'll talk about this probably a lot more later on. And so, coming to the policy measures, the hotspots. It has nothing to do with it's an awkward, I think, an awkward name for it, but it's more registration centers. People are now here, they get registered, fingerprinted, and those that have a good chance of getting asylum or protection, mostly here, judging by the country where they come from, this is mostly Syrians, but also from Eritrea. Those people will be relocated, and we have now a quota of 160,000 that will be relocated within the EU. For all others who are screened and where we see that their asylum request will be negative, we have to figure out they will be kept in those countries still until the increase. But we need to figure out what will happen. How will they be returned? And Frontex is also is supposed to help with this.
And we'll come back to the issue of the people who are denied asylum, what happens to them, because it's clearly a big issue. I mean, how do you judge this? I mean, obviously, Susan, you are in the US, but you're an expert on European policy. I mean, how do you judge this? Because the relocations that you were talking about, you were saying to me 17 people in total have been, that's not a big number considering that 1 million are expected to come into Germany. I mean, how would you judge this?
I would agree basically with what Astrid said, but maybe be a little bit more negative in terms of what's been done in practice. I think that the principles that have been established in terms of relocation, the idea that all European Union countries need to play a role and there needs to be a mechanism for determining who is responsible for asylum claims, because Dublin and the principles of Dublin aren't working. I think establishing that principle has been very valuable, and also what has been done in terms of trying to provide more aid to the countries that are hosting most of the refugees. The additional $1 billion or €1 billion that will be provided to European or to UN agencies who are dealing with the Syria response. I think that's also a great principle that's been set. In practice, there's still quite a lot more to be done, figuring out exactly how these things will work. As you said, only 17 people have been relocated so far. And it's also unclear, ideally the way the hotspots will work is that people will be registered there. Their claims will have an initial assessment, whether or not they would qualify for relocation, whether or not they might be put into expedited procedures if they're from a safe country of origin and returned. But how do you ensure that people are going to stay there while they're being processed? It's something that no one has an answer to yet. And we've already seen that many people choose not to try their luck in one of the hotspot reception centers and to continue moving on. And if you have people who are waiting there to be processed, they need to have housing, they need to be fed, and that's already something that Greece is struggling with. And as you have more and more people waiting there, it's going to become a greater challenge. So I think as I said, the principles are great, but in practice, there's a lot more that needs to be done.
For those who didn't know, the reference to the Dublin Treaty is this rule that says that you have to seek asylum in the country in which you land or you arrive within the European Union. And clearly that's been a strain, because if everybody's arriving in Italy and Greece, then everybody in theory should be asking asylum in Italy and Greece. But you wanted to jump in here, and then I want to go to Naomi, but you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, I wanted to add to the most successful or best working policies 2 points. One is the search and rescue mission that was being picked up again after the Italian one was cancelled in the spring. So also we see many more people now crossing the Mediterranean. We have actually less people drowning, although still much too many, but less people drowning than last year when less people came. And the other one, and I think this is the most successful policy, is Merkel's open door policy. Because if she wouldn't have done this, and if she wouldn't have said it, that refugees, asylum seekers are welcome in Germany, we would have seen people piling up on these tiny Greek islands, and the terrible situation we see now there would have been even much worse. Probably we would have seen people dying.
So the issue of leadership here. Naomi, this is the situation in Europe. Can you give us a sort of a panoramic view of what you have seen in the US? I mean, what the policies have been in the US when faced with a dramatic influx, and listening to what has been attempted in Europe. You know, what would you say that works, does not work, and what can be learned on both sides of the ocean?
Sure. I first just want to thank Zocalo Public Square and Democracy International and NPR Berlin for having me here this evening. It is not lost on me the significance of having this conversation in Berlin. And that is because precisely of what you just mentioned, which is the extraordinary political leadership that Germany has shown in the face of this refugee crisis. I can say that I'm coming from a country where we have not seen that political leadership, nowhere close. Since the start of the conflict in Syria, the United States has resettled 1,993 Syrian refugees. Keep in mind that it's laughable, except it's so pathetic, and it's people's lives that we're talking about. But keep in mind, right, that Germany is talking about welcoming 800,000 Syrians this year. And I know it's not easy. I know there are complications, and I know that there are pushbacks in some places. But the United States has, let me reiterate, 1,993. It's also important to keep in mind that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that 400,000 Syrians are in need of resettlement. That's 10% of the 4 million refugees who have fled from Syria, the vast majority of whom are still living in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq and Egypt. So while there are many, obviously, Syrian refugees coming to Europe, we need to remember where the vast majority of Syrians are. The bottom line in the United States is that if we wanted to resettle more Syrian refugees, we could. If we had the political will, we could do that. The coalition for which I work, Refugee Council USA, is calling for the administration in the United States to resettle 100,000 Syrians in 2016. That is on top of the 85,000 refugees from all over the world that the administration recently announced we would aim to resettle next year. Out of those 85,000, 10,000 are supposed to be Syrian. Even if we resettle 10,000 Syrians next year, it's nowhere close to enough. We know why Syrians are fleeing. They're fleeing to save their lives. They are fleeing to feed their families. They're fleeing to find security, something we would all do, a decision we would all make if we were faced with those same circumstances. And the way we welcome refugees in the United States, I think, is really a testament to who we are as Americans. Since 1975, we have resettled more than 3 million refugees from all over the world, and these refugees have contributed economically and culturally to communities around the country. And it's time for us to step up and have this political leadership again. The American public, I believe, wants to do this. My organization and the organizations that I work with have received thousands and thousands of calls and emails these last several months saying, how can we help? How can we welcome Syrians into our community? And it's really time to translate that power, that interest into real political action so that the United States steps up and fulfills its obligation as a world leader and a world refugee protection leader.
I want to go back to civil society later because you mentioned this. I mean, clearly there are political risks is what's happening in Germany. I mean, Merkel, there are limitations to what she has said is her obligation. And she's receiving lots of criticism from within.
Yeah.
Astrid.
Well, I think first we have to point out that, yes, it's now received as the open door policy, but first we have to say that this number of 800,000, I received a lot of calls from foreign correspondents in the times when this number was announced, and people always thought, oh, wow, Germany has this quota of 800,000. It's not a quota. It's not an open arms policy in the beginning. It was merely stating the fact of how many people we were expecting. So I think we have to make this distinction. Yes, then the pressure increased on Merkel, actually, also from the city government, that she needed to do something as more and more people kept coming because of the message that we would take, or her decision actually, in beginning of September, when people were marching from the train station. We have to remember the timeline here. They were marching on the Autobahn, and this is when she said, okay, these people can come in. I think she personally meant that this was really just for these people, for this segment. But it, of course, and this is what we can learn, and I think this is also connecting to the US, communication plays such an important role, and there's been so many rumors, misperceptions about Germany's role and openness. Yes, the pictures, we have seen them, they are there, but it was not an open invitation.
But what's the biggest misperception?
Well, for example, we hear that, and the German embassies have to fight a lot of rumors that Germany will send ships to Lebanon and Turkey. Apparently, people are waiting there at the shores because they are told Germany will save them. Or that everyone can get asylum. You just need to start moving, and we are seeing that people from Afghanistan are asking for passports and to get travel documents because they hear anyone who has a travel document can get asylum in Germany. So we're seeing that there's a lot of misinformation.
And you raise an interesting point. I mean, is there an increasing tension between the asylum seekers and all the economic migrants, obviously, that have always come into Europe, especially lately through Libya, through northern Africa, through Italy and up? Has this put a strain on the definition? I mean, and for our US audience, perhaps, how does that defined even in Europe? Susan.
I think that there is a challenge due to the mixed nature of the flows. It creates practically it creates an additional processing challenge, trying to determine who is a refugee according to the legal definition.
And sorry, is that a problem in the US? I mean, do you face that same problem where how do you define them?
Well, in the US we have...
This is an interesting...
In the US we have two systems that we're talking about. The system with which I'm most familiar is our refugee resettlement program, when we resettle refugees from countries of first asylum. So we resettle a Syrian refugee from Jordan. We also have an asylum system, which is largely what we're talking about in the European context, when refugees show up on American shores and say, hey, I can't go back to my country. I can't because of persecution. May I stay here? So in both situations, though, there are very strict adjudication processes and screening processes. So we know for sure who is coming and that they are, in fact, meeting the refugee definition.
Whereas in Europe, I'll let you continue.
This has been one of the challenges, is that the screening process where people are arriving in Greece hasn't been functioning in the way that it ideally would, part because of the number of flows that are arriving, and in part because of deficiencies that have been long-standing in many of these places where people are arriving. And there have been issues with the Greek Asylum Service and Registration Service for many years now, and they've been exacerbated by these issues because, as we said, you need to do an individual determination for each person to determine whether or not they're a refugee or a refugee according to the legal definition or arriving for other reasons. But there's just one further point that I would make here. Which I think is another lesson to be drawn from this particular crisis, is that while there's a clear legal definition between who qualifies as a refugee and who does not, individual motivations are much more difficult to parse in that clean manner. And what we've seen with many of the people coming from Syria is they aren't necessarily coming directly from Syria. Many of them are coming from Turkey, Jordan, or Lebanon, where they haven't faced persecution or generalized violence in the same way. But there's a lack of opportunity, and there's a lack of the means to earn a living, provide education and a future for their children. And that's a slightly different motivation. So it's for each individual, it's not quite as easy to make that distinction.
Astrid?
Yeah. points actually to make it even more complicated. Sometimes it changes along the migration path. So people might have just wanted to originally migrate for economic reasons to, for example, countries like Libya. We shall not forget that this was also a destination country for people to work in. But then they find themselves in a situation where it gets unstable and they need to move on to other countries. So then, or they are being persecuted, so then they become a refugee, or they become actually really have grounds for persecution. And the other point is that in Germany, we saw that for the first half of the year, in 2015, about 40% were actually people from the Western Balkans. So not transiting through the Western Balkans, but originating from the Western Balkans. And this is where we have seen a lot of action, actually, from Merkel and the government. It's your German word of the day. It's the Asylverfahrenbeschleunigungsgesetz. We love long words. But this is a package that will go into force on November.
Wenzel, you wanted to jump in quickly on this.
Yeah, we see a lot of competition between refugees and migrants when they are, for example, queuing up at the reception centers. And we see a lot of competition between the individual refugees from different countries. So, for example, the Syrians are our pet refugees. We love Syrians. And Syrians became a synonym for refugees. And everybody from Iraq and Afghanistan is supposedly a migrant. So even in the refugee centers, the two-class system is very obvious, and there we see people fighting with each other.
And the Syrians became the preferred people, let's say, because of
for obvious
education standards or demographic reasons, or clearly because they were fleeing.
The latest conflict, horrible, well-reported barrel bombs, gas. I mean, you name it. And we kind of get used to the hardship of Iraqis and Afghans. So this is kind of the newest.
Because there was some criticism of Germany in other parts of Europe that Germany was being open to Syrians who were considered very highly educated young men who would do good for the German economy, which is why I asked.
It's probably partly true, but I mean, Iraqis are no morons, so they're also young, educated people.
Quickly to wrap up, though, because this gets into an issue that I wanted to touch on, and that is the reuniting of families, which is something that is very important here, but also runs into challenges. Tell us quickly your experience in the U.S. What is done, and what Europe can learn from the U.S. example, which has worked quite successfully, you were saying.
Sure. So in the United States, family reunification in the refugee resettlement context is really important. So much so that the U.S. government has an entire category of consideration for refugee resettlement based entirely on family reunification. There are some challenges with that, though, because in order to come to the United States through that family reunification program, you must have a relative in the United States say, yes, bring my relative. And that relative in the United States must have arrived as a refugee himself or herself. And then to come through the program, you have to either be a married child under the age of 21, a spouse, or a parent to the relative in the United States. And while that has been very helpful for the refugees who have come through that program, what my coalition is calling for is, in this time of great humanitarian crisis, that we expand that program so that people who are in the United States, Syrian Americans, who might not have come to the United States as refugees, likely did not, they should also be able to bring their family through the refugee resettlement program. And we also want to have an expanded definition of family. So siblings, nieces, nephews, grandparents, they're all important parts of our families, and they need to be able to come to the United States too. But as a basic concept, we understand that the reunions of families is critical, and especially for longer-term integration. And it's very hard to integrate into any new country if you are constantly worrying about your family who remains in danger overseas.
Whereas in Europe, is there a European policy, or is it on a nation-by-nation basis, this particular topic?
It's nation by nation. For example, in Germany, you have to be under 19, so you have to be 18, and to ask that your parents are coming. And it's only, actually, it's a spouse and children policy only. The reality is often different. Sometimes those relatives have died in bombs, and your next and closest relatives, maybe your aunt or your grandmother.
I think that I'm going to now turn to our American audience in New York we've discussed already rapid fire, put lots of issues on the table, but perhaps our American audience would like to ask some questions or make some comments. However, I would like the audience here in Berlin also, if you have questions, to just raise your hands, because I'll make a note of it and we will come back to Berlin after having gone to New York. Jackie, to you.
Thank you so very much, Alessandra. I'd like to welcome any audience members here who have questions or comments. Just queue up at these microphones that you see here. And next, we're going to go to, I'd like to welcome Professor Richard Alba up to the microphone. Richard is a sociology professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, and he's co-author of a book on immigration and its challenges in North America and Western Europe. Richard, you've been listening to this. You know the situation very well. The word immigration is a lightning rod here. We're talking about a refugee crisis, not necessarily an immigration one. So what do we take away as a lesson that is applicable either here or internationally?
Well, I think this is really a pretty unique situation. I mean, as I think about the American experience, as Naomi has said, there's really nothing comparable. I'm an integration expert. That's what I've spent my research life studying. And sort of the comment or question that I have really regards sort of the longer term. In Germany in particular, since Germany has, let me say, been really so generous, and the German people, I think, have shown themselves to be motivated by very generous impulses in the way that so many of them have received these migrants. And like Naomi, I think as an American, I feel ashamed, actually, that the United States has been absent from this discussion when, in fact, we have such a heavy responsibility for the events that are happening in that part of the world. That said, I have to say I'm very concerned for the longer run situation in Germany. This strikes me as an extraordinarily heavy lift for Germany. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be accepted as asylum applicants, and many of them we know coming from Syria and Iraq are they are middle-class people. They have some degree of training and professional experience, but I think they're going to have a great deal of difficulty in translating their knowledge and experiences that they bring with them from home into any kind of commensurate position in the German labor market, which is very highly regulated. Der Spiegel has been running articles about, well, one case is an orthopedist from Syria who speaks German and in 14 months has been unable to find a job. Another article is about the apprenticeships that many of these adult workers will have to go through in order to find a decent position in the German labor market. The shortest one that Der Spiegel thinks will be viable is a 2-year program. In addition, we know that they're going to be bringing eventually their children with them. These children have in many cases been out of school for a while, so not only do they not know German, but they are really behind in their schooling. So it's not just the adults that we need to be worried about, but also how are the children going to fare. This is really a 2-generation problem that Germany is going to have to face. And finally, one has to ask, we're talking about a very heavily Muslim immigration into European societies, including Germany, that, to be honest, have shown themselves to be very wary about Muslim populations, and where, the Muslim, non-Muslim boundary is really a major societal cleavage. So I guess I'm interested in hearing the thoughts of the panel about how is this integration process going to proceed, and does it have a chance to be successful?
Not that this absolves the U.S. in any way, but I will just point out that the U.S. has contributed a significant financial lift to this crisis of $4.5 billion. That doesn't begin to meet all the issues we've been talking about, I realize. So let's go back to Berlin, Alessandra, because I know you have a lot of people queuing up at your mics, and ask some of your guests in the audience if they'd like to ask a question of your panelists.
Yeah, before doing that though, we have an example. You mentioned generosity, and I would like to ask the Germans, and the ones who have direct experience about this generosity, about how civil society has accepted, embraced this appeal by Merkel. And you yourself, right? Whether you have a refugee in your home.
Yeah, I have a young doctor living in my home, and I think this becomes part of the reality in Germany at the moment. There's no choice. Either he lives in my home or with 500 other guys somewhere in a reception center. But the gentleman, I think he painted a too dark a picture because, first of all, young people learn languages very fast. They're very motivated. My friend Hamba, who lives in my house, as I said, he's a doctor, and what he needs is another 8 months or a year at the university, and then he can work as a doctor. There's a lack of doctors here because our doctors tend to go to Norway or the United States where they make more money. So we also have migrants, German migrants. So yes, it's a challenge, it's difficult, but it's also something wonderful that happens. And we see so many volunteers. We see the birth of civil society in Germany, not only demonstrating or talking clever, but really helping, hands-on, going to these reception centers. Now, after months doing this, we see also some fatigue. People are tired, people are nervous, but so we just have to organize it better.
So nervous about what? Exactly. And how is this manifested? Because this is some of the risks that will be talked about, obviously.
Well, we certainly see a strain, and we see a strain on the infrastructure. And as Professor Alba also pointed out, I mean, it will be the question, how do you provide in a times when more and more people keep coming, when the numbers are not slowing down?
How do you stop it? You don't at this point, right?
Well, that's the question. I mean, this is what Merkel's task is currently, and this is why she realizes she has to work on the European level. She has to work with the international level. This is why she's currently going to Turkey, why she is trying to strike deals there, what at other times she probably would not have done. I mean, we are really in ethical dilemmas.
Well, you might want to mention this deal, and this deal is basically an exchange saying to Turkey, Germany has traditionally not been very keen on EU membership for Turkey, but now that there's this crisis at the doorsteps of Europe, she is offering perhaps the prospect of EU membership for Turkey, but in exchange some help by Turkey to stem the flow of people who are coming into the rest of Europe. And some people say that's a very dangerous tit for tat, or a very dangerous exchange. Susan.
I was just going to weigh in on the integration side of it, because I think it is a very important issue that's been raised concerning the labor market integration piece and getting people into jobs as quickly as possible, because most of the individuals who are arriving will be here and they will stay. And it's important to make those investments as quickly as possible. And as the gentleman said, it's going to be difficult. But I think Germany has some policies in place that will work quite to its advantage. There's a credential recognition law here that's been in place for a few years to try to help people assess their skills and assess their qualifications. And I think that's something that other European countries can learn from, but there's still a lot of challenges. There are challenges, as he mentioned, with training and getting people access into training. And I think there's going to need to be quite a bit of thought about how those policies can be made more flexible and more accessible for everyone.
And money on the table, obviously.
Yeah.
But what about, the big, one of the many elephants, I suppose, in the room, this growing Muslim population. We have to say there is nervousness across Europe about this. Isn't this manifested in Germany? No. You look at me as...
They have to grow up. Germany's not a Christian state, and that's the reality. What shall we do? Anyway, asylum seekers are coming.
Is this the reality, or is this your wish?
No, it's not my wish. I don't want particularly Buddhists or Muslims or whoever. These are people who come here. Most people actually I met are not very religious. Otherwise, they might not want to flee. And they feel quite comfortable where they are in ISIS land. So, and amongst that...
You're saying they would have preferred to stay in ISIS land? Is that what you're saying?
Well, if they're so religious, and they might not have a problem with that, because there is some new statistics out in America that the percentage of immigrants or migrants from Muslim countries to America who became radical or terrorists is the lowest. It's lower amongst this group.
So, multiculturalism, multi-religion of the US. I mean, what does the US teach Europe about this topic?
Well, to quote my colleague to the left, I mean, I think we also need to grow up in many respects, because although I believe it is a very vocal but small minority in the United States, we also have pushback from different pockets of people who say we don't want Muslims to come to the United States. But I think it is a very, very small minority of people, and it has been evidenced in the last several weeks and months. Many more people are saying that's not who we are as Americans. That does not reflect our American values of welcoming refugees and welcoming immigrants. We want to welcome the most vulnerable refugees, regardless of religion. And what we have proven since we've been doing massive refugee resettlement for the last several decades is that it doesn't matter what religion you are. We have resettled many Muslim refugees from Somalia, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and they have all integrated into their local communities. Of course, there are challenges. I don't mean to minimize how hard it is to start your life fresh in a new country, but these refugees have done extraordinarily well, and there is no historic precedent to show that Muslim refugees coming to the United States have had any more difficulties than any other refugee group, or have wanted to do harm in the United States, which is one of the arguments that we keep hearing. There's just no historic backing to that argument. And I would just also say that one of the reasons that I think it has been so successful is because of the civil society partnership with refugees and with the Refugee Resettlement Program.
We have a question here. Sorry, we had long answers, but very interesting ones.
Marcus Walker from the Wall Street Journal. 2 quick questions. Can the relocation idea work? This is the main policy device that the EU has come up with, and the logic is obvious. You spread the people, so you spread the burden and the costs. But it relies on the refugees actually wanting to live somewhere other than Germany. And Luxembourg was just unable to find even 30 people who wanted to move to Luxembourg. Among the hundreds of thousands who've come through Greece, they could find 15 so far. So if everybody wants to live in Germany, or to a lesser extent Sweden, is relocation a moot idea that gets argued over at EU summits and has no relevance? Secondly, how did Germany end up becoming the America of the EU, the land of hope and opportunity where everybody's going to make their fortune and find a better life? As the gentleman in New York said, it has a very bureaucratic labor market. It's very hard to get work permits. Even people who could do a job that's available have to prove there's absolutely nobody else in the country already who could do it. It doesn't have a good record at integrating people, and I think it will have big problems because of its own issues in its labor market. So how did this happen? Was it Merkel's rhetoric that convinced everybody in Syria that you have to go to Germany? Or did this idea take root beforehand? I guess it's big, it has a strong economy, but where did this idea come from?
First of all, we had welcomed Syrian refugees for many years, and the numbers were actually kept under the carpet. There were tens of thousands of Syrian refugees coming under special programs for the last 4 years. So they have families and friends, and they want to come to Germany. Second of all, to the second question with the labor market, if I walk around in Berlin and walk by my local bakery, they're always looking for apprentices. The German industry, the corporations, they're looking for people who are working for them. They go to schools. They say, come on, don't go to university, become a plumber, and we pay a lot of money. So the German labor market needs young people. I think it's now a very good time for welcoming those refugees. On the other hand, of course, there comes a point when this is saturated, and that's a whole different topic we will discuss later.
But was this Merkel's speech? Was it, because I would like to also, adding to Marcus's question, only 17 so far, 17 have actually been relocated, I believe Eritreans from Italy to Sweden, so not exactly a successful policy in terms of numbers.
Okay, so yes, Marcus pointed out that yes, so far not a lot of people have been relocated, and the challenge will be how do we ensure that people actually want to go to Poland or to others and other countries where signals have also been, well, we don't know, we only want a certain type of refugees, etc. And how do we prevent that people will not move towards where the labor is? So we need to make sure that those countries in the relocation plans can also offer that opportunity. And we need to ensure that family groups, that we actually in the relocation plan, they look into family groups. Because only if you have family members with you or clans or whatever, then people tend to also settle. It will not be an easy process. It might not work, you're absolutely right. But the question is, what's the alternative? I think we're currently struggling to say what the alternatives really are. There has been a long struggle to find a quota system, and finally we are moving towards that. We will see a more permanent quota system, I'm sure, though no one wants to say it.
Alessandra, if I could just jump in here. We've got quite a few people queuing up here in New York who are eager to get into the discussion as well. I know you can't see them. So let's go to our American audience. I'm thinking as you're speaking, many of us, we may have taken in far fewer refugees now, but lots of people have come here because we are direct descendants of that experience. So let's begin by our first questioner. And would you just state your name and a little bit about yourself? And
Hi, thanks for the opportunity for the question. My name's Carol Barton. I'm with a faith-based women's organization, United Methodist Women, that also is an active United Methodist Church in Germany, receiving migrants. And I'm also part of a global civil society network called the Women and Global Migration Working Group. I'm just back, just a few days back from Turkey, from the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which was hosted by Turkey with active participation of much of the EU. I think that there was a great deal of hand-wringing on the part of the EU about the refugee crisis when the conversation is a much broader one. And I think that one of the messages that we brought as civil society is that we're accepting some false boxes when we accept the terms of who is a refugee and who is a forced migrant and who is an economic migrant. And we were reminded by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the UN recently that all of the people who are moving are bearers of human rights, and that we can't pit one against another saying that this one's deserving and this isn't because they fit a particular category. And it was interesting, we had the opportunity to meet with the US delegation, and the Assistant Secretary of State, Ann Richards, acknowledged that refugee policies from the 1950s are broken, and that there are forced migrants coming who may not fit the refugee categories, but clearly have merit because it's too dangerous for them to go home. And I wanted to shift a little bit the focus. Clearly, the United States should be receiving more Syrian refugees, but I think to broaden the conversation, the situation we've had on our US-Mexico border of refugees seeking asylum from Central America is one that we need to talk about instead of just how U.S. receives Syrian refugees. That what we have is a global phenomenon of people on the move for multiple reasons who are named different things by international law, and states, both the EU and the U.S., are responding by criminalization. In the U.S. we have Operation Streamline, we have detention centers, and in Europe we now have the hot spots, which will say these people will get in and these people will have to go back.
Let me just push back though a little bit, because while you're absolutely right, I think it's difficult in some ways to talk about any kind of crisis of people moving. We are very, very aware that the whole notion of immigration in this country is almost a third rail now in American politics. But we're also looking for ways, I think, to find a path out internationally for all these people on the move. And since you are representing the faith-based community and just did so in Turkey, maybe you could speak a little to ideas, solutions, contributions that faith organizations might make.
Well, much of my work over the past year following the surge, or whatever we call it, of Central American women and children has been being out in conversation with faith communities about why we don't want to respond with a xenophobic response. And I think that by and large, as the panel has said, both in Germany and in the US, there's a really heartfelt welcoming. There's in the national politics a xenophobic trend, but I think groups are welcoming. So part of it is welcoming, but part of it is that we're also engaged in advocacy. For example, telling the United States that they shouldn't extend their border to the Mexican Central American border, finance Mexico to keep people from ever getting to the U.S. to seek asylum, which is also what Angela Merkel was just doing in Turkey. What the countries are doing is saying, instead of receiving refugees, how do we shift the problem to other places and militarize those borders and criminalize the people who are coming?
All right, thank you. We're going to take a very short break here, and when we come back, we're going to look ahead at how the refugee crisis is likely to play out, if anyone can answer that, in policies in Europe and here and the world, how we might influence those things. We'll come back in just a moment.
This isn't actually a real break.
Thank you, Richard.
And thank you all. If you have questions, remember, make sure we'll have a little bit more back and forth with Germany, and we'll have another opportunity to ask questions as well.
What I would suggest is if you have a question of a specific panelist there in Germany, just go ahead and say so. And boy, it really helps if you keep your answers and your observations as short and pithy as possible. Just, because they will be once we edit it anyway. So you might as well save us the labor. All right? Thank you. It's great, though. All right, are you ready to start again? Welcome back to our discussion on what can the world learn from Europe's refugee crisis. I'm Jackie Leiden. This is an international public square with America Abroad, and we're partnering today with Zocalo Public Square, Democracy International, and NPR Berlin. I'd like to welcome back our audiences here in New York at WNYC's Green Space and in Berlin at Deutsche Bank. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. My co-host in Berlin is Alessandra Galloni. She's global news editor for Reuters. Alessandra, we spent the first part of this program talking about the crisis fault lines in Europe, how some countries have been responding. Let's look ahead. We did already, of course, engage that. We're trying to look a little bit into the crystal ball, but build on experience. And so my first question for panelists there is, if you could, I mean, we understand that the EU hasn't come to an international consensus. If you could put in place the policies that were most effective to accommodate this refugee crisis, what might they be?
Who wants to take that easy question? Susan, I stopped you twice, so go ahead.
Well, I had a couple of other comments that I can come back to those. I mean, I think it's a very tough question, a very good one, though. I think there are elements in what the EU has been trying to do so far that are positive and that could be strengthened. I think the efforts that have been made to try to improve registration, emergency response, those sorts of things all would need to be part of a perfect solution, as would the conversation about how to divide responsibility within the European Union and also providing more aid in the region. The additional point that I would just make, though, is that this is a global issue and it requires a global response. This is not Europe's problem alone. The U.S. has already contributed quite a bit of aid, but as we already heard from Naomi, we could do more in terms of offering places. Canada has now said that they will take in 25,000 people by the end of the year. But there's more that could be done in terms of offering places and aid. And that's, I guess, one of the broader points that I wanted to make in response to the comment earlier is that I think one of the lessons that we can take from this crisis in particular is that migration and refugee crises aren't just an issue for migration policymakers or for humanitarian agencies. These are crises that need to be viewed from a foreign policy perspective, from a development perspective, and we can't wait until they reach our borders. We need to be intervening earlier to try to resolve some of the the conflicts that are producing displacement, but also to provide aid and assistance to the countries that are hosting most of the world's refugees. You hear quite a bit. 86% of the world's refugees are being hosted in developing countries, and they're facing their own challenges.
So is that your policy answer to Jackie's question?
I do. I think it needs to be viewed from a global perspective, and you need to strengthen some of the internal procedures in terms of how people are processed when they arrive, how they're received, which I think the EU is now working towards doing in an effective way.
Yeah.
And I would just also add to that in addition to thinking about what happens once refugees arrive in Europe, we need to be thinking about creating other legal, safe options and other legal migration mechanisms so that refugees aren't forced to hide and then perhaps die in the back of a truck or, crowd on the rubber rafts. There are more dignified ways for human beings to get to safety, and we need to think about how we can implement those creatively as a global community.
And to Susan's point, I think, as a former war reporter, I have to say, instant recognition that there are many kinds of global dislocation, war certainly being one, and that is an immediate consequence of conflict. And then, of course, there's other reasons like climate change, refugees. Let's take another question here in our audience, and then we'd love to hear more from the German audience. And yes, please, your name.
Hi, my name is Lizzie. I'm from the Schiller Institute. And I have a question for the two panelists, for the German and American, and a proposal. So,
all right, but you have to keep it really, really short, Lucy.
Yes, very short. So there's just been this release on this drone documents from The Intercept, which also released the Snowden things. And it's on Obama's drone policy, how 90% of the people who are killed, victims in Middle East, are civilians, how they track them by phone, and sometimes there's a mistake and it's a mother instead of the targeted person, and these things are personally signed by Obama.
Well, I think, though, that we really want to take a look at what the refugee crisis is.
I'll come.
All right?
So
and some
in
policy
Germany,
proposals for that.
Yeah. In Germany, in Bundestag, Brandon Bryant, who's a U.S. drone pilot, he said that Germany is giving actual intelligence through Ramstein base to this. And the thing is, these are all civilians being bombed there. You have people in Germany who are filing that their families have been bombed with drone, and they're filing lawsuit against U.S., against Germany.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I'm going to move on, actually.
So my question is, if you think this can lead to impeachment of Obama, and if Germany is going to take distance to this, and if you think that you could work with Russia and China to develop the Middle East and build it up with infrastructure as solution, take the Silk Road of China and take it to the Middle East. What do you think about that?
What I would like to ask Wenzel is, when you see, and of course you do, the kinds of physical conditions at which people arrive, whether it's in Germany or Austria or wherever people get to, you've had eyes on the ground all over the place. How prepared are these communities, and how prepared should we be? You mentioned people sleeping on cots, but some of these people have had enormous physical stress. So a sort of health proposal, if you will, going forward.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most urgent problems we're facing. People arrive here in Europe, arrive in Germany with illnesses, with broken limbs. But I think even more urgent is, more pressing, is that a lot of them are really traumatized. So if we can't get these people back on track and help them psychologically, then we really will have a problem. We see a lot of violence in camps or in reception areas, and while they're registering, and refugees told me this is because these people are hyper nervous. They are exhausted, and they went through years and years and years of trauma, and now the journey was traumatized. Now they're in Germany, and everything is chaotic. They hear from other people, we don't want you, you're a Muslim. So this is a problem that we are creating. If we don't help them, then really we can forget talking about integration.
I want to go back to putting together the three of the questions, both in New York and here, sort of under the umbrella of what Marcus Walker was saying, which was how did Germany suddenly become the US? And some of the key words that came were xenophobia and the strain on labor policy. And these are two issues when we're looking at the consequences of this crisis that I think we should tackle. Susan, I would like to go back to you on the strain on labor policy. I mean, it is true that many people, why do they want to come to Germany? Because Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. You know, all the people who come from Italy, let me tell you, I live there, I know it, they don't want to stay in Italy. You know, in fact, they do everything they can not to get fingerprinted. And because the Italian police turns a blind eye because they know that Italy could not possibly sustain them economically. So eventually this bill will become a strain, and more so even for a strong economy. There is no denying that, as much as we want to be generous. So what do you do?
I think it is going to be an issue for the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. It's something that needs to be addressed from very beginning. I mean, as you said, it's going to be a strain. There's a need to invest resources now, getting people in the labor market. Germany has already made changes to the law to try to allow people in after 3 months into jobs, but there are still tremendous barriers to accessing those jobs. Priority, whether or not other foreign nationals get priority, issues of credentials, which we already heard about, language issues. These are things that I also think the tremendous civil society response that we've seen in Germany and elsewhere can step in and fill, providing some of these supplements to provide language training to help people become acclimated. I think there's a greater role for civil society to play.
So your policy ideas are developing here. We're going to get a full paper by the end of the panel. Yes, Naomi.
I would just like to add, also building off of the question posed, since how did Germany become the United States? I should say that in the United States, our refugee resettlement program is predicated on the basic concept of self-sufficiency. Refugees are expected to go to work as quickly as possible. And what we have seen over the decades of resettlement practice in the United States, that refugees are a net gain economically to local communities. They start more small businesses than other groups. They are paying taxes from the second they arrive in our local communities. So sort of this concept that refugees are coming without this desire to work or without this desire to contribute has just not been proven to be the case in the United States. And one of the ways that refugees get to work so quickly in the United States is because of their partnerships with civil society. Our refugee resettlement program is based on the public-private partnership. We have a network of nonprofit organizations around the country working with refugees to help them get on their feet, faith-based groups, ethnic community-based organizations. There's an entire community of people working with refugees so that they can start their lives fresh in America. So I just wanted to sort of push back on the concept that refugees aren't contributing members to American society and that they aren't coming to work. They are taking jobs that they need to work to support their families, just like you or I would.
Astrid, pass it to you, but a quick question. Here in Europe, it is difficult. Asylum seekers sometimes have to wait up to 18 months, a year to 18 months to have a work permit.
That's where we get into the beauty of the European Union. You have, we have a European asylum common system that we want to put in place with common standards, but we're not there yet. So you have individual measures, and it really depends which country you are living in. So that always also determines if you can have access to the labor market. I wanted to point out, Marcus mentioned the Americanization, when has Germany become that? I mean, it's not a new process. Germany is actually, according to the OECD, one of the countries with the most open labor markets, and because we did know about our demographic shift. So in the past years, we have made a lot of changes to the labor market and to the laws. This was not geared towards asylum seekers. Last year, Germany saw 200,000. Those numbers now seem minuscule when we talk about our numbers now. But infrastructure has been put in place, so I'm not as pessimistic. It needs a lot of resources, but Germany has resources. I think we can manage. It will take a lot of effort, but it's manageable.
It depends very much on the politics. If the politics are supportive of what you just said, then it will work. If the scaremongers, the meek, the cowards are winning and convince the people that they should be xenophobe, Islamophobe, then this will work as well.
Susan?
I was just going to add, I think Germany is in a good place and has, the size of the challenge is obviously going to be huge, but has some things to teach other EU countries in that regard in terms of what Germany has done to allow for the recognition of migrants' credentials and to allow access to training opportunities. I think there's definitely some learning that could happen there.
It's easier said in Germany, which is a richer country than most of the other European countries in the European Union. I mean, it has to be said.
I want to make a connection also to the United States. And I think one aspect that we're not, I mean, we are talking always about xenophobia, but it has to be mentioned. I mean, there's a real task for politicians now to talk to the receiving society. And we always leave that out of the equation when we look into infrastructure or funds to spend. And this is where there's an organization in the US, the Welcoming America, that at least in the beginning really focused on the receiving society. And how do we make sure that people understand that their society is changing, how this will affect them, but how it can also be managed and how we can take away some of the fears and misperceptions.
Jackie, just to ask you, did you have any other questions from your end?
We do have one here, I believe. Yes, thank you for asking. Let's go ahead, please.
Okay, hi. My name is Teresa Woods. I teach at the Cardozo Law School here in New York. I run the Refugee Representation Project of a Human Rights Clinic. My question is, if we pull back a bit from the on-the-ground perspective and we see that there are many refugees in protracted situations around the globe. You spoke earlier about preferences for Syrian refugees over other groups that are arriving to Germany. And so I would just want to ask the panel of experts how they would reconcile these preferences based on country of origin vis-a-vis this global picture where there are many refugees sitting in camps around the world.
Thank you.
It's not an easy question. Who would like to tackle that?
Well, I will just say for Refugee Council USA's advocacy, we are saying that we should welcome in 2016 100,000 Syrians, but on top of 85,000 refugees from other parts of the world, because we recognize that globally we're looking at the largest refugee crisis since World War II, and Syrians comprise 4 million of those 19 million. That's a significant number, but there are forced massive displacements still going on in other parts of the world. And it's also important to remember that of the 3 durable solutions, what we call the 3 durable solutions for refugees, including resettlement, return to one's home country, or integration in a country of first asylum, what we're seeing is that almost nobody's able to return home right now. Last year, globally, only 126,000 refugees were able to return home. So that tells us that we as a global community really need to start thinking differently about how we respond to mass forced migration movements, because if people can't go home, we need to start thinking about not only more resettlement, which in the best of circumstances will still only be a very small number of people, but what we can be doing to make lives better for refugees living in countries around the world and the communities in which they're living, the host communities.
No. It's a difficult question over there in New York. We have one here in Berlin.
My name is Anna Richard. I'm from a project called Refugees on Rails, which is a programming school here in Berlin.
Sorry.
And I'm wondering, we're really looking at how can we push innovation in the refugee crisis and really try to come up with unique solutions. And my question to you is, have you come across truly innovative ways to work within this crisis and ideas that can really be scaled?
Naomi.
Well, I can't speak to innovative solutions in Europe, but what I can say is that in the United States, there are numbers of creative ways the local communities have thought about working with refugees. Everything from different types of local refugee youth groups to how to get faith communities more involved, to thinking about business incubator opportunities, to creative ways to do English language lessons in places of employment. The list goes on and on and on. I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. But again, I keep going back to the importance of the role of civil society in the US, where so many great ideas about welcoming and how to incorporate refugees into their local communities. That's where the great ideas are really coming from.
Astrid, and then Susan.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited that we're living in these times where we have new technology and people like you also being creative. And in Germany, we have seen, for example, an Airbnb for refugees and for pairing people in need of homes with people who are wanting to share. We have seen online universities for refugees who want to continue their education, but they can't have access to a formal university, and they can do that from the camps or from wherever they are. So we're seeing more and more, as you said, it's the birth also of a new society here.
Susan.
Yeah, I think this is something that may not be quite as innovative of a solution because it's existed for quite a while in Canada, but one of the things that there's been a lot of conversation about in Europe recently is the idea of private sponsorship, and I think this is another area where civil society can play a role. The idea that individuals or communities can come together to sponsor a refugee and bring them over from a community in Lebanon or Turkey and Jordan and help support them and help them to find a place in their new home. And that's something that Germany has done on a small scale with Syrians already, and it's an idea that I think could be rolled out a bit more broadly in Europe as a whole, taking advantage of some of this new civil society interest.
Alex, we have one more question here, Alessandra. Yes, please.
Oh, hi. My name is actually Alex. I'm from the International Refugee Assistance Project.
Yes, Alexides?
Yes, absolutely.
Let me just say, we'd like to welcome Alexides, who is here from the International Refugee Project.
Right, and so we're an organization that partners law students with lawyers working on refugee cases, and we represent thousands of refugees throughout the Middle East coming to Europe. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about, sort of looking ahead, I know that we're looking for solutions and trying to figure out how to sort of work through this mess. One of the most important things that we see, and this kind of echoes a couple things that have been mentioned, is this idea of recognizing that this is really an international issue. This is just now coming to Europe and is really struggling with capacity, but we've been seeing these issues happening in Lebanon and in Turkey and in Jordan for years. I actually worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Turkey in the summer of 2014, and they were already struggling with issues of registration and how to process and protect people when they were getting there. And so this is an issue that we're seeing now, but it's also an issue that's been happening throughout the Middle East for years now. And so I would love to hear what you have to say sort of about how to address those concrete pieces of protection for especially vulnerable individuals, for example, in Germany as they're getting there, but also to recognize that this is something that we've been seeing everywhere. And as we look for sort of creative solutions, we believe that this is a really key piece to look at, the idea of how do we efficiently and in an organized manner and in a fair way provide registration and protection for refugees from wherever their first place of asylum is. And so within the European system, it's looking like Greece and Hungary, but a lot of these people are registering first in places like Turkey or Lebanon, so we believe that it translates to a broader issue, and I'd love to hear about what you're doing in Germany. Thank you.
Perhaps in a quick sentence.
Yes.
Consistency of processing, perhaps, between countries, something like that?
Yes,
Yeah?
there's an organized and fair way to register and protect these individuals. Thank you.
Maybe we start with Wenzel on the ground. What's happening?
It's a mess in Germany. People don't want to get registered in Greece or anywhere else. Even if the civil servants that try to register, they try to sneak away from that because the obvious reason is they want to be registered in Germany. And that's it, full stop. And I have no idea how you can change it. I think nobody has at the moment.
I mean, in some countries, in the border countries of Greece and Italy, they've had to revert to force in order to get people to register and fingerprint because they normally would not want to. Astrid, did you have something to add?
I would say, I mean, this is the whole reason for the interest in EU hotspots is because there's been a lack of trust in the ability of Greece and Italy and other countries that should be the ones doing this on the ground in their ability to implement these systems. So I think on the EU level, there's been a need for greater support from other countries that have more experience, like Germany, in doing this to do it effectively on the ground. And that's something that hasn't been entirely forthcoming. I think the European Commission said that they're lacking many of the officers that they've asked for to actually start to process and supplement the processing on the ground.
Yeah, but the problem is, I mean, you can't force it. They're not prisoners. You can't force them. You can't pin them down, right?
But they're treated as prisoners often, and that's the big problem.
Well, but the challenge is that you have to make the standards the same. And of course, this is what the ideal, the goal would be, so that you, and the question is, how can we achieve that and how can we get there? It will take a lot of time. I don't blame anyone, of course, who wants to head somewhere where there's a better standard, but unfortunately, we need to find a system that might work. And if you have those rules, and if you have a decent way of at least living, and you are safe, this is the question, how can we provide at the moment that people can be safe? And if this is the first and foremost aim, then yes, you can provide it also in other countries than Germany.
Alessandra, we're going to take one more question here before we run out of time. Thank you. Would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, sure. Lena Servastova. I run a social innovation firm, and we work on migration issues. We're going to take a storytelling platform that we did to the Mediterranean, and I'm going to a 19 million project in Rome next month. And we're talking to activists in Italy and Greece about local response. And my questions to the panelists, there have been a lot of creative responses in Italy and Greece from the citizen level, from the local level, and they are hindered by a lack of funding. So what is the role of austerity policies in local responses? I've heard a lot about, how Germany's reacting, but what about Greece and Italy and how they're hindered by austerity?
And can I just add to that, what about social media as a part of the solution here? Because you sort of touched on that. Panelists?
Before answering the question, we have another question in Berlin.
Yes,
so if it's
okay, let's take them together. Good.
Let's take two questions so then the panelists can answer since we're running out of time. Please.
Hello, I'm Andres Martinez. I'm part of the Zocalo team, and I also teach at Arizona State University. And perhaps it's because I'm an American, I'm a little bit confused about whether the destination, the host for these refugees is the individual nation state or the European Union. We've talked a lot about here tonight as to, why suddenly did Germany, or over time, become the magnet, the United States of Europe? We've talked about whether people are going to want to be relocated to Luxembourg or Poland. And so my question, I guess, would be for Wenzel and Astrid. Do you think that the refugee seeking asylum has a right to pick a country, or am I arriving at the European Union and therefore should be open to being relocated to any member state? And I guess the second part of the question would be, in the long run, does it make a difference if you have freedom of labor movement within the EU? Can't I then just pick up and leave Poland and go to Germany over time? I mean, it's hard for us, I think, coming from the US to sort of sort that question out.
That's a very good question. Remember, you're answering both questions. And just since one of the questions was regarding Italy, I would just say that it's not so much the austerity policies. Rather, it's that many of these people who come into Italy and Greece are coming into the south of these countries, or in the case of Greece, in the islands. Those are the poorest parts of these countries, and they barely have structures for people that are living there. And so now they're faced with this influx, and they don't have basic homes, they don't have food in many cases for the people. So yes, it does hamper that, not so much for austerity policies in times of economic crisis, such as the last few years, but just basically because these parts of the countries are quite poor.
I can talk about Greece. It's not a matter of funding because there was enough money. It's just a matter of priority. There was enough money from the EU, from the UNHCR, from the International Red Cross. The thing was that this money was focused on building detention centers. And now the new Greek government has built in Athens, and I've been there, a wonderful welcome center. But they don't get money for that because the money is for detention centers. And this is a big
This is EU money that was given to
EU money
Greece.
it was getting, and then it was Greek politics, it was racist politics that they didn't want to spend or waste any thought about refugees for a long, long time. We were criticizing this at least since 2010.
But I should say that there has been a lot of civil society jumping in also in Italy and in Greece,
Absolutely.
in particular on the islands and
also
on
Hungary.
the
I mean,
fringes.
this civil society was great. It's still great, yeah.
And now to the second, which is a very important question, because that gets to the heart of the difference between the EU, obviously, and the US, and that the US can make a single policy, the EU cannot.
Well, yes, that's the beauty of the EU again. What we're striving, as we said, there is a common European asylum system, or a standard that we want to achieve. And your question was, well, are we entering the EU, or is someone entering a nation state? And ideally, of course, in the long run, we want to come to a setting where they enter the EU. But as long as the standards are not the same, of course, they're entering a nation state. But we know from some surveys that when they head to the EU, they don't necessarily all already know that they want to come to Germany. We also shall not forget that Sweden takes up a lot of refugees, and per capita, I mean, those numbers are also quite known. But yes, and the question was also, well, aren't they moving freely anyhow once they enter the countries? The idea here is, in the relocation plan at least, if they are entering or if they are relocated to a certain country, then they also receive the benefits there, and if they're registered. And usually you have a 5-year rule that you have to stay in that country before you can move to another EU member state. But of course, the question is it more enticing to go into the black economy and to work there, because you might not have any access to a good job, and you're willing to give up some of your rights? That might be an option for some. And so the question is, will we see a rise of irregular migrants that are living in the black or in the shadow economy, don't have access to rights or services?
Susan.
I would just say that I think that's an interesting question also to pose at a global level. Do you have a right to choose where you seek asylum? Because it's something that we're seeing from many of the people moving on from the countries of first asylum, like Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. They are already safe from protection, but they don't have access to opportunities. Do you have the right to choose where you go based on the level of opportunities and rights that will be offered to you?
Wenzel, quickly, and then no.
I think Human Rights Watch thinks there is no right to pick a country. But you can't force anybody to live in a country. So there's a dilemma.
And I would just add to that I'm not sure how much choice there really is. When somebody is choosing to leave Turkey to make their way to Europe, I don't think it's because, nobody's suggesting this, but it's not because they want a vacation in Berlin. It's because they're not able to work in Turkey, because their kids can't go to school. I mean, these are basic fundamental things. So I'm not sure how much choice there really is there. And I think we just need to keep remembering that these are human beings and not animals. And so if somebody comes to Europe and says, I have an uncle in Sweden, I'm getting to Sweden, I'm not going to Poland, of course that makes sense. I mean, that goes back to the family reunification piece we were talking about earlier. I think we just need to keep in mind that we need to treat this crisis in a humane and dignified way, and to really keep in mind, again, just to reiterate, that there is not a lot of choice when people are leaving their countries of first asylum. They're doing it to save their lives.
But the short answer, it seems to be, to the question is, are they entering a nation state or the EU, is they're entering a nation state, and it's likely to stay that way for a long time.
Once they have a work permit and are asylums, then they can work within
But the entry and the rules to entry.
The entry, yeah.
It's definitely nation state
yes.
for a while. Okay, Jackie, did you have anything else there? I think that we're going to wrap it up. So, okay. Thank you so much, everyone. This concludes our discussion of what the world can learn from Europe's refugee crisis. Thank you. We'd especially like...
And now we invite all of you to join us at our reception just outside the doors. Please stay around. Drinks, wine, and food. Stay around.
We'll have it. Okay. We have cookies and some coffee. Do you want me to do this last? Do you want me to?
We're going to read one more line and then do one more applause, and then we'll let you guys go.
15 more seconds, if you'll bear with me, for production. We'd like to thank our production partners, Zocalo Public Square, Democracy International, and NPR Berlin, and also my co-host, Alessandra Galloni, Global News Editor for Reuters, and her guests, Naomi Steinberg with Refugee Council USA, Astrid Ziebarth with the German Marshall Fund, Susan Fotzke with the Migration Policy Institute, and Wenzel Mikulski with Human Rights Watch in Germany. Also thanks to WNYC's Green Space and Deutsche Bank, and of course to you, our audiences. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, cookies and coffee. Well, it came on. It's only 1:30. Okay.